Sam and Nicki, I appreciate you guys taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Good to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, listen, I'm really excited to be diving into this topic here today. But before we do, why don't you give listeners and viewers a little whirlwind tour of your backgrounds, and then we can dive into things.
So my name is Nicki. I'm a trained chef and been working in cycling for the past 10, 11 years now. My journey has been that I started out as a chef and got interested into the nutrition side of things. So started a bachelor's in nutrition, finished that a few years ago, and I'm now doing a master's in public health, so still nutrition related. I haven't been able to do any courses in sports nutrition. It's not really something they do in Denmark and Norway where I'm located. So everything has been more the clinical side of nutrition.
I'm Sam Impey, based in the UK. My PhD was around carbohydrate periodization, and yeah, I guess that fuel for the work required mantra, which I think is going to be on my gravestone at this stage.
Nice. Worst things to have.
Yeah, true. And yeah, I've been kind of working in cycling for about 5 or 6 years at different levels. And Nicki and I have been working together at what was Mitchelton Scott and now Bike Exchange for the last 3 years.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, if folks are interested, we had Sam on in the earlier season 3 of the podcast, talking all about that fuel for the work required. And in today's episode, I'd love to dive into the tour that just passed and you guys supporting the team. Maybe Sam will kick it off with yourself in terms of just the build up to a tour. What's going into obviously the tremendous amount of planning with the whole team, but for yourself, what are some of the things that you're thinking about to be able to get the athletes, the riders ready to perform their best?
Yeah, geez, it's a good question. I guess there's probably 2 parts to it, a bit of a kind of academic and thought process part, and then a bit of a kind of operational part to it. So the sort of thought process as I would approach it is kind of looking at where the athletes are in terms of what races have they come off, what kind of training load have they come off. It's really important to get the coach's opinion in terms of like where they are and what sort of things they need to work on. In this kind of final period, or how much rest they're going to be having, and just sort of looking at what their preload is going into the tour. So once you've had those discussions, then it's pretty easy to kind of identify what someone's kind of maybe 1, maybe 2 sort of key points are, work on. And then you just kind of integrate that around a lot of the sort of basic stuff that our coaches do very, very well, which, something that Nicki and I have been developing for a while. So kind of encouraging that kind of gut training piece in that last few weeks in the build up to the tour. So using the products and race foods that are going to be at the tour kind of in increasing quantities in training, just for that bit of gut training. Also, if we need to do any sort of final manipulations in terms of like body composition or that tends to happen ideally sort of 6 minimum, but ideally 8, maybe even 10 weeks out, probably around some of the pre-tour camps and races that were going on. So for me, that's kind of how I'd approach it, from a sort of thinking it out and mapping it out. In terms of making that operational,
and actually, Sam, if we pause there just quickly, for practitioners or listeners who aren't as familiar, how many athletes, riders are we talking about in a team? And could you maybe just circle back to that gut training and what's going on there for, again, people who aren't as familiar?
Yeah. So the tour squad is 8. That is right, isn't it, Nicki?
Yeah, 8 riders.
Yeah, so it'd be 8 riders. So they'd all have quite often you wouldn't necessarily get all 8 at the same races and camps in the build-up. It depends on how the race program is operating. So you'd have 2, 3, maybe 4 of them at the same camp or in the same race block, kind of in the build-up to the tour. That's how we operate. It probably could be different in different teams, but it's good for the climbers to work together. It's good for the engine room guys to work together in the build-up. So from that perspective, around the gut training thing, how we certainly operate is that you kind of in I guess general training, as much as there is of that in a cycling season, you kind of leave the guys to it, give them some recommendations around total amounts. So like if you want to work on a training shorter training ride, maybe it's 30 grams an hour for, those sort of 3, maybe 4 hour rides. Maybe when you get up to the 4, 5, 6 hour rides, you kind of slide up the scale to maybe it's 40, maybe it's 50 grams an hour in sort of general training in terms of carbohydrate intake on bike, and how people achieve that's kind of down to them. Maybe it actually kind of works out because they'd stop and have lunch, or they'd have just, buy a sports drink from a garage on the side of the road, or if they didn't want to have, if they didn't want to be constantly using the sort of race specific products and stuff that, that we have for the team. So, and then, in that, to accommodate that sort of gut training piece as we get into that more sort of crucial time period, particularly in that sort of heaviest 2 weeks of training prior to a taper. If that happens to be a race, then that's also great. Is just really ramp up or encourage the increased use of the race specific foods, race specific drinks, and increasing those quantities on bike, so that ideally you'd get a couple of sessions, like a full race replication. So 90 grams an hour plus carbohydrates for, a good 4 or 5 hours, just to really get that whole process of repetition of eating, processing, digesting, and doing that under high stress, high load. But I don't know, Nicki, if you have any other thoughts on that.
No, I think you sort of covered everything pretty well there, Sam. Obviously, I'm there for camps and races leading up to it, so a lot of the times we try to really mimic what we'll do in the bigger races. So if we're at a camp, then we'll try to have the same foods and stuff like that would normally be at the race, just to sort of get into that whole routine with the different foods and keeping it similar throughout the period.
It's something that, sorry, Mark, I was just going to say, it's something that we certainly have pushed more to now, is trying where possible to have one of the team chefs at all the camps, the altitude camps that we do, for example. Exactly as Nicki said, just because you're sort of adding on another layer of consistency. The chefs have styles of food, and so they kind of, the guys get used to that in a training specific setting, as well as into a race specific setting.
Yeah, I mean, it's tremendous. And one of the things that jumped out when you guys were in the tour, Sam, was when you sent out a tweet, I think it was, around the amount of grams per kilo for a day. And we're getting up to, what was it, 11, 12, 13. So I imagine to hit some of those totals, you obviously need some of those sport specific formulas. But I imagine, Nicki, as the chef, it becomes pretty critical too, of thinking how we're going to get to these totals. So can you guys walk us through what are some of the changes? What are some of the things that are being implemented to be able to achieve those high loads? Because it's a full-time job, isn't it, trying to hit those totals?
Yeah, so the average for the first block of racing up until the first rest day, I think the average intake was 13 grams per kilo per day. There was a time trial in that as well, where the guys were down at about 6 grams per kilo per day. And equally, there was I think the 250K stage and one of the big mountain stages was also in there, where they got up as high as 18 grams per kilo per day.
Wow.
So 13 was about the average there across the first block. So it's a monumental amount of food. You're up into the 1 point something kilos of carbohydrate, not food, just carbohydrate across the day for that.
Yeah. So how do we get that into, I mean, obviously riders to that level are somewhat accustomed to it, or very accustomed to it. But I mean, everybody else listening in or supporting athletes is trying to figure out, how would I get somebody to that level? So, Nicki, with working with the athletes on your side, what are the changes on the food front? Is it meal frequency? Are there various things that go into being able to hit those totals?
Yeah, it's a lot of food, like you said. I think one of the days we calculated, like, it was the equivalent of eating 5 kilos of cooked pasta. It's one of those things you really need to think about the energy density of the food that you're serving. So on those big days, it's a lot of pasta, it's a lot of bread, and even like some sugary drinks and stuff like that at the meal times, smoothies, anything that, sort of helps keep the quantity of food down, especially towards the back end of a grand tour, where like they're tired of pedaling their bikes.
Tired of eating.
They're tired of eating. So you just get to a point where they're just like, there's no enjoyment in actually eating the food. It's more like they're just forcing it down. So at that point, it's critical to try and come up with something that can sort of spark their interest in the food and get them to eat, drink more. And on those big days, it's a lot of the times, sweet things, drinks, those type of things that sort of helps get the total carb intake up to the level that they need.
I mean, it's really split over it's actually 2 meals per se in the day. That's I think the thing that is often challenging is the actual physical meals are only breakfast and dinner, where the guys will sit down at a table and, you know, eat a meal as you kind of conceptualize it. But we also have like recovery protocols on the bus. So like the chefs will prepare recovery foods, which, you know, we standardize just to help the guys hit some of the carb recommendation targets for like after race. And so you're actually looking at, just 2 kind of enormous meals. The recovery period, which is super important. We place a real high value on those first 2 hours after the race. But equally, then when you think about it, it's actually to reach an energy balance. It shows how important hitting a good amount of carbohydrate on the bike is, because actually, like, you could get to 50% of your carbohydrate intake for the day on the bike. And so that's where that's the sort of next step on from that gut training piece. So like if someone really massively underfuels on the bike but doesn't hit a good on-bike total, the logistical challenge of getting close to an energy balance for the day is
have to catch up, right?
Exactly.
You can't imagine.
Yeah, we really saw that in the Giro this year with especially one of our riders who didn't eat enough on the bike in those like big Giro days, and he ended up having to eat, I think it was like 1.5 kilos of pasta plus 200 grams of bread plus dessert for dinner. Yeah. So that really shows the importance of eating over the whole day and just making sure that you get enough on the bike. Otherwise, you're stuck with a lot of food that you need to eat at dinner.
And trying to go to bed and sleep well after
that kind of meal.
Yeah, when you're rolling up the stairs is challenging. So
a lot of American football players and rugby players listening in going, "Hey, geez, I would love that challenge." But so you talk about those first couple of hours post training or post race. You know, what are some of those strategies then on the bus? Or what might that look like from some of those meals? Maybe it's over to Nicki around the things that we're implementing to be able to get that fuel in to help that recovery in those key first few hours.
So on the bus, a lot of the times it's also about keeping quantity down, because appetite is not the biggest just after the race. So one of the things that Sam brought into the team, and a lot of riders really like him for that, is Haribo.
Nice,
so on the bus after the race, a lot of the times, you know, it's the first hour where they're just coming off the bike. It's a lot of, very dense food. So Haribos, soft drinks and stuff like that. And then in the second hour, we lean towards real food. So then it's more rice, pasta, bread, and those types of foods, just to give something that also fills up the stomach a bit.
Yeah, it is amazing how you can get 100 grams of carbs in pretty easily and quickly with Haribo, Jelly Babies, a couple sodas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and yeah, just a bit of a, like, whilst that stuff's still sweet, it's not like the flavor profile's different to like what they've been going through all day. So it's just that, like, it's a bit of contrast in there as well. And there was definitely a management piece when we sort of started doing that. You get
everybody wants Haribo all day long.
It's now. Literally like rip open a family bag and it's just like straight on pouring it down the neck. You're like, all right, easy guys. You
portion those out for the athletes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, or you find a small bag that is fits pretty well for a portion size.
And Chef, what are some of the solid foods then that you might get into? I imagine you're still on the bus that the guys would then go for after having that quick fuel immediately post.
On the bus, we're sort of limited to what we can pre-cook and reheat in a microwave. So most of the times it will be pasta that's pre-cooked, and then they have sauces on the side they can add to it, heat it in a microwave and eat it. So it's pasta, rice. There'll be some sandwiches, different fruits and yogurts, just to get some extra protein in. And there's obviously also protein shakes. Some of the riders like to have, tuna with their pasta. So there's those things. So it's on the bus, it's more about being practical rather than having, a big selection. And
Michelin meals for later.
Yeah, exactly. Like it just, and also you have to consider, like, you need to be able to eat it while driving.
Yeah.
So I worked with riders before who wanted boiled potatoes, but it was just sort of a problem. They're rolling all over the plate and stuff like that. So on the bus, it has to be very practical, and it has to be something that, can easily be managed by people on the bus while they're driving.
Yeah, it's interesting, the subtleties of rolling potatoes, derailing things. And what about some of those flavor profiles? I mean, obviously that's key when we're talking about going from sweet to salty and these different flavors that can help the brain to stay hungry and not to achieve that level of satiation where, it's natural, as you said, that at the end of a tour, it's tough to eat. But as you switch those over, I imagine you're able to stimulate the appetite a little bit. Can you walk us through some of the different strategies that you might have to do that?
Yeah, so in a grand tour, like with the meals and stuff, we sort of, have those favorites that all of the riders really like and crave. So we try to put those towards the end of a grand tour, and then keep it a bit more plain boring at the start, if you want to call it that. And then,
leaving them with the carrot towards the end of the
yeah, exactly. Like, whenever you cook spaghetti bolognese, it's just always a big hit with the guys. So, you save those towards the end and try to, keep them motivated to eating by bringing out some favorites.
We have a pretty good there's quite a decent curry culture in our team. So
nice.
They have a good butter chicken or a tikka masala or something for that generally gets the guys pretty happy, pretty stoked.
Awesome. And Sam, I mean, before I cut you off there on the operations side, I'm sure we've touched on pieces of it. Maybe we can circle back to that around all those logistics or some of the main factors there that you've got to consider to achieve all this.
The guys who make this happen isn't me. I think that needs to be the first, like the value of having talented chefs, people who have a kind of a deep knowledge of the sport as well as nutrition and food, is absolutely invaluable. So the value of having like really genuinely incredible chefs just makes my job so much easier. So we have Nicki and Sean, the other chef, who joined our team 2 years ago. Again, great guy, American background, living in Spain, and has just really, engaged in our process, and, been really keen to learn what we do. So the value of having incredible chefs is, I really can't highlight enough. So that's a big one. And then the second one would be the at race staff. So the soigneurs and the carers and stuff who again, just do the little bits and pieces of the logistics and stuff that actually make all this stuff operational. So, again, they work relentlessly when they're at races. It's exhausting watching them do their thing. So, again, I think, we have a very culturally diverse group of staff, which is cool. That actually brings its own innovation as well as bringing its own challenges, which is awesome. So those two pieces, again, I can't highlight enough. And from my end, I guess it's just trying to distill down nutritional goals into the most simple way you can convey them. Like for the recovery protocol, for example, when I joined the team, the first thing I showed Nicki was like super complex, and like there were multiple moving parts, and we'd like break it up into weight categories. And from making stuff operational, we've just like really pared it back to like a super simple message. So it's like first 2 hours, 1.5 gram per kilo carbs, have some protein in the second hour, like 20 to 40 grams. That's it. Keep it super, super simple. That was probably the biggest challenge for me, is actually, you get in and you get excited and
get that gold standard of this is exactly what we're going to do. And then the real life's in there. And wait a minute, we got to find that.
Exactly. Yeah. And then written it out. I've done something and I hand it to someone whose English isn't their first language. And they're like, cool, thanks. It's no reflection on them. Like they're already busy and I'm giving them something to interpret or work. And that's for me to actually look at and go, okay, what's the best way I can deliver this message, or how can I get on the ground and show people how to implement stuff. And that when you do that and communicate well, that's when things work better.
It's interesting how even having different nationalities almost makes that so crystal clear, where sometimes when everyone's speaking the same language, you might get a lot of head nodding and acting as if someone understands that and they can implement it, versus some of those other situations where it's just crystal clear off the bat that, hey, we've got to figure out the way in between here because this person is not taking this on board. And
exactly. And like, credit to all the staff we've got, because my ability I can barely speak English. So learning Spanish or Italian is not going to be, is just a struggle for me massively.
Yeah. If we Shift gears here a little bit, Sam, and talk about some of that carbohydrate periodization. How much of this is happening in the build up to a tour? How much is happening, stage to stage? Can you walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, Nicki and I have both done a lot of work with the coaches in giving them the tools to prescribe a function of dietary periodization along with their training. So most of the coaches have kind of complete autonomy now around how they add nutritional stress onto their training, and sometimes we'll just check in to go, is today a good day to do fasted rides? Can we do some high carb rides? Can we do some longer duration so you actually kind of get into real low glycogen at the back end? Mm-hmm. They'll sometimes check in with the specifics, but Nicki and I have both done a decent block of work with giving the coaches the autonomy to do that. So they tend to prescribe carbohydrate or energy periodization around certain blocks of training. Obviously, when intensity ramps up and duration or race specific training ramps up, we tend to just not create too much deficit there if we can. Try and create energy deficits earlier on in the training block for body composition goals. And then when it gets to racing, I guess it's kind of, if we think about those, as I say, that first week where we had between 6 and 18 gram per kilo per day carb requirements, that kind of comes down to some of the stuff Nicki was talking about varying the density of foods for volume. So once the guys get used to processing heaps of food, like just a physically large amount of food, if you then give them a small amount of food, they're like, I'm absolutely starving here. Like, what, even though they might be at energy balance or in excess of their calorie needs for the day, but the body just gets so used to processing food that quickly that they end up just being completely starving. So Nicki can attest more to some of the manipulations of the actual foods that would go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nicki, those mornings where it's a fasted ride must be pretty nice. You just making coffee for the boys or what?
Well, pretty much. When we're at training camps, a lot of the guys, they will actually, if they do, fasted rides in the morning, I won't see them. It's an easy morning for me. But it just means that...
Not too many of those though, right?
There's not too many of those, but it just means that, lunch is often a bit more complicated. So you sort of move your focus from the breakfast towards, getting the recovery done really well after a fasted ride, and sort of to try and get them close to energy balance again. When they start off their morning fasted, it just means that they have to catch up later in the day somehow or over the next few days. So there's always, a balance, and it's a teamwork between, Sam and myself, or Sam and one of the other chefs who are at camp. Just that communication, like, what are we trying to achieve? How do we best achieve it? Is it okay to be in a big deficit today and then sort of catch up over the next few days that are going to be easier? So that's one of the things that Sam really brought to the team when he first arrived like 3 years ago, that whole teamwork between chefs, coaches, and himself. So everyone is sort of, always pitching in with their ideas and what is the plan for the next few days. Then Sam can give recommendations. I can adjust the food to try and match that. So it's that balance between the group that just always helps out.
Yeah, it's amazing when everyone can start speaking a bit of the same language, even if the coaches aren't the performance nutritionist or the chef, but they understand what Sam's doing. They understand what you're doing now. All of a sudden they're taking it on board, and they can, that intuition and that coach's eye can start to lead to some suggestions. And so that's really fantastic work. And if we shift gears to talk body composition, Nicki, what are some of the things that you're doing if you do have an athlete, and of course, Sam as well? Certain rider, we need to get leaner. Other riders, you're trying to maintain weight. How do you keep in track of all this, and what are some of the strategies to help achieve that?
On a day-to-day basis, we obviously adjust the food to try and match the energy needs for that day. So easier days we'll go less dense food, and on other days we'll go more food, more like calorie dense foods. And then Sam and I have made this sort of system to give the riders recommendations on what they need to hit their daily targets, calorie wise. So we use that system to sort of give them recommendations on the food, but we also lean towards that. We try to educate riders rather than give them prescriptions. So we sort of make an effort to actually educate them into why are we doing this? Why should you eat this today instead of something else? So we don't end up with a bunch of robots who only
rely on you guys to make every decision.
Exactly. Like ideally, we want the riders to be able to handle it themselves, and then we're just there for support. Sometimes we have riders that need a bit more support than others, but that's sort of the whole philosophy behind it and what we're trying to achieve. So when we're trying to achieve those body compositions with different riders at camp, we would normally give them different recommendations. Everyone have the same meal, like buffet style, and then each rider get their individual recommendations to try and match their needs. They would normally train together, so energy requirements are more or less the same depending on weight and size of the rider.
With the system that we use, it's very much an opt-in system. So we don't know riders are ever told or given like you're doing, we call it CHAMP is the name of it. So which is like the acronym kind of works out to carbohydrate manipulation protocol.
Nice.
One of the coaches came up with it. We thought it was a pretty good name, actually.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So, but it's very much like an opt-in process. So each athlete is inherently different in their personality, and how they work best is entirely unique to them. So like there are within the system that we use, there are like, I guess, think of it as different levels of intensity. So we can prescribe, carbs, proteins, fats, or we can just get someone's like, I just want carb recommendations for this block. Or some guys like, I just want to check in. Maybe I'll send you some photos of my food for a couple of days. Just tell me if I'm heading in the right direction. So it's very much a self-selection thing. But it's been pretty interesting that actually when we first started this a couple of years ago, is that we started with 1 or 2 riders and they got good results pretty quickly. And then, people are, other riders are like, oh, hey, what's
going on over there?
Exactly. And it's sort of quite naturally, the interest in it quite naturally grew, and the sort of adherence and buy-in from having guys self-select and come to you and they make the decision to engage or not engage, which is challenging. Like you do have to sometimes do a bit of salesman stuff to get people on board, but because of the buy-in, it just inherently makes the process more successful and kind of more efficient, more work efficient for the time that Nicki and I will put into it.
Yeah, it's always amazing how some athletes like more hands-on and more information from the coach practitioner, where some actually, if they get too much, can cause a bit of anxiety or whatnot. They prefer that lighter touch. And to your point, I mean, athletes are people too, and it's like all of a sudden they're making decisions because they say, well, I'm not too sure about this, but all of a sudden the teammate starts really performing well and recovering well. And now all of a sudden they're over asking you questions, and they've got that internal motivation and buying in, as you say there. On that body composition question, in terms of testing, are there, is it DEXA scans ahead of time or at certain points of the season? Are you using, in the field, calipers? What kind of things might you be using to assess that in your riders?
We just track body weight, and where we can, we'll do skin folds. So like at a camp, if we have a particular target, a rider who wants to lose a bit of weight, then what we'll try and do is get we track weight pretty regularly. Most days, most riders will track it. Again, self-selection thing, not all riders do, that's okay. But from a targeting body composition, it'll be get weight, get skin folds, beginning. If it's an extended period, we'll do beginning, middle, and end. If it's like a 2-week focus block, we'll just do beginning and end. It's kind of a confirmation piece, because at altitude, and if you add on, like, given the amount of glycogen that these guys can get through, like, you can see 2 kilo weight shifts in a day, like easy, and they're only light guys, so you're looking at quite a relatively large percentage of body weight. So whilst the scales are pretty important, and that's what is really important to the riders, the calipers is kind of what gives the confirmation around we're heading in the right direction. So if you get a reduction in weight and a reduction in skin folds, cool, then
trending well.
Exactly. If you get a reduction in weight and the skin folds are the same, depends on if you've been at altitude or not. That could be like plasma volume shift. Like, look at the day before. Like, so we try and do it off the back of a rest day. So like if you had 6 hours of training the day before and then you did it the next morning, you'd probably be light on glycogen. So is that reflective of a shift in tissue or not? The calipers just add some nuance around the the function of the change on the scales.
100%. And if we actually circle back a bit here, Sam, I'm sure some viewers listening in want to know in terms of caloric expenditure, if we just kind of revisit some of the fundamentals, how are you guys calculating that in order to be able to put your finger on how much energy your riders are going to be needing?
So we use a prediction equation, or we use the Mifflin-St. equation for predicting resting metabolic rate. It seems to work pretty well with our group of guys. We're very lucky in that cycling we have power meters, so we have a direct measure of
what they're doing.
Yeah, which makes our job significantly easier than trying to do this.
It's not like basketball.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of some sports where it'd be horrendous to do it, like NFL would comes to mind, or rugby, or
collisions, and
any of the collision-based sports would be just a nightmare to do this. So I'm glad we have nice, easy ways to collect the data. And then depending on where they're at race or in training camp, we use like a different physical activity level. So like we use a percentage of resting metabolic rate to equate the energy from walking around and doing non-on-bike stuff. And then, we take a measure of thermic effect of food, because particularly with our guys, that
can be high when you're consuming that much food too, right?
Yeah. So I was trying to go for a run like every few days when I was on the tour, and I could go and do 5K or something. We had some spare time, and like I'd burn like, I don't know, like 400 or 500 kcal, whatever. Yeah. And actually the guys burn more calories digesting their food than I do exercising. Like, wow. It's insane when you think about it that way.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah. So like when you talk about like food sweats, you're like, well, that actually completely makes sense, because I'm not surprised that you guys are running hot if you're the amount of energy that
calories.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if we touched about altitude here, and we'll bring it back to Nicki here in one sec. When we talk about that altitude, what are some of the considerations that you've got to think about when you're going into some of these mountain stages? Whether it's sweat rates, whether oxygen levels. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, I guess most of the guys spend a good amount of time at altitude during the year anyway. Quite a few of them live fairly high, or at least have somewhere they go.
Good strategy.
So yeah, in terms of just, I guess, at races, we have quite a focus on making sure we can deliver good nutrition products. So we make sure we have plenty of hydration options at the base or towards the ideally both the base and the top of a climb. Depends where on the stage that is, and the sort of topography will depend on what we give, whether it's like we put gels on the carb bottles, we give a more carbohydrate dense drink, or whether it's just a electrolyte solution based on the temperature. So there are a few different ways to kind of really think about it, but that's more to do with I guess how the team sets up its preparation for the day, more so than specifically talking to an athlete in the morning and saying, okay, we need to think about this, we need to think X, Y, or Z more often. So yeah, some of the guys don't do that much altitude work in training because they just don't respond that well to it. That's kind of a function of, I think that's a function of the athlete and the coach learning what works really well for them. So, but it's always good to, those first few days when you're adapting, keep an eye on your hydration levels. If you're really high, you might get real weird altitude dreams. That's definitely a thing. Nice. So yeah, don't be too upset.
Don't be alarmed.
Yeah, don't be alarmed. And yeah, we try not to run any big energy deficits in that sort of first few days of just acclimatization, really, just to not put any undue stress on the body while it's adapting.
I was going to say, obviously, those big mountain stages from a muscular standpoint, a lot of recovery going on there. So, over to you, Nicki, in terms of the volume of food. I mean, you've sort of walked us through some of the strategies there before, but what are some of the things that you're thinking about on that recovery side, and has supplementation become part of, more of a focus there? Again,
with the recovery, my job is pretty simple with the recovery. I'm just providing a bit of food. Sam is the one who's doing all the other fancy stuff around that.
Mm-hmm. We sort of separate out the foods that you guys would provide at certain meals. Like we differentiate like different days. So
yeah, like Sam said, we sort of make sure that red meats and those types of foods are not served the day before big climbs, and in general, we try to keep it less fiber dense days leading up to it. We don't have many riders who will do a specific low fiber diet. But we sort of think about, not serving up too many high fiber foods days before, and try to keep the weight down and make sure they don't gain any extra weight, at least just from undigested fibers.
Is that the main reason there then, in terms of just the added weight, in terms of adopting that low fiber diet?
From what I know and what I've been told, that will be the main thing. Obviously, in the recovery phase, foods that are higher in fiber also tend to be less dense. So that's why we try to avoid those foods in the recovery phase, and fibers are just slower to digest compared to simple sugars.
Fill you up too much.
Yeah. Around the meal times, some riders just feel like they need their fibers. I guess just from a gut point of view, they actually feel it when they go lower in fibers. So we have riders that will eat high amounts of vegetables every day just to make sure that they have a good gut function, and that they sort of make sure that the gut is still
running somewhat normally.
Yeah. For our big guys, it doesn't make any difference if they are a kilo heavier on the day. It would make a big difference though if they're constipated or have any gut issues. So sort of need to find that balance. Is it worth it putting, a race at risk just to gain that extra?
Yeah, technically is correct, but actually in real life is causing some distress in terms of how they're feeling and operating.
And I mean, for a 1 day race, you could probably get through, but when you have to do 21 stages, it's a different story.
And then equally, the reverse of that is we try and make operational on kind of rest days. So yeah, foods that are less nutrient or less energy dense, again, just to replicate that big volume of food, or bigger volume of food, but with significantly less calories in it. Just because obviously the expenditure on rest days is significantly less. And again, like, it's something that's mirrored in the food that the chefs will provide. So moved from pastas to like couscous or quinoas or that kind of stuff, and salads and vegetables, and it's trying to keep people happy. As you say, everyone's human.
Yeah, it's always interesting with the size of the meal. Sometimes obviously people just think that the plate's full and there's going to be a lot of calories, and of course, to what you're saying here, you can shift some of those really dense carbohydrates to lesser dense ones, and all of a sudden the plate can still be nice and full for the riders and athletes, but we're really, you're changing the carbohydrates and the energy quite significantly. And on the supplement side of things, when we're getting into a tour and towards the end of a tour, or maybe obviously throughout, are there different strategies that come in from a recovery standpoint with supplementation, or are we staying consistent with what riders are used to, throughout their season?
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly from like a recovery perspective, I guess the only thing we'd probably add in race is maybe something like a cherry juice. Get some of those, the sort of polyphenol components, and just as a, look, it's certainly not going to help, and it might do some good from a recovery perspective. So something like that, I guess, would be the only kind of major addition I can think of. From a supplement perspective, we try and take a pretty simple approach, in my opinion. And, it's very much things like a multivitamin most of the guys will take. Some of the guys will take kind of L-carnitine in the build up to and throughout a tour. Again, that's kind of a personal preference piece. Quite often the guys will have done butyralenine load coming in, nitrates around TTs, some vitamin D in race, some caffeine, nothing too crazy, I don't think. We try to operate on quite an evidence-based approach, which does sort of does keep the number of supplements down to an extent. So
for sure,
yeah, there are riders who kind of show up with their own things and do their own stuff, and that's the great thing about having a wide variety of nationalities and personalities and approaches to. There are some guys who are super supplement heavy and some who are pretty light touch. It's a personal preference thing, I think.
I was going to say as well, when you have different countries involved, it's always interesting because you can get a sense of the supplements in various, your own country or, whatnot. But then all of a sudden you start expanding out to 5, 6, 7, 8 different countries. It gets tough to keep track of everything. And, when you get an athlete who's taking a lot of various supplements, I mean, what's the protocol there in terms of how do you address that with them? Because I know this is a question I get a lot from practitioners around, they might be taking a lot of supplements, some of them evidence-based and effective, some of them, not harmful and clean. And then so it becomes this question of do we just let them take it because they're used to it and they feel like they get a difference from it? Can you talk us through how you might deal with athletes?
Yeah, I mean, look, certainly from my perspective, it's very much a case of, as long as the supplement is not doing harm, if an athlete has brought it and they buy into it or it makes them feel good, as long as it's not doing harm and is obviously, free of banned substances, ideally, personally for me, a supplement would always be informed sport tested. That's my opinion. Again, that opinion varies significantly based on the cultural background and cultural preference. So that can be challenging, but it is something you sometimes have to navigate. Generally speaking, if a recommended dose is 1, cyclists will take 5.
Yeah, exactly.
So that sometimes can be, you're like, are you not sleeping well? Maybe don't have 7 grams of taurine today then. There can be some nuanced stuff just around like managing some dosage stuff, just because if 1's recommended, well, 2 must be better and 5 is definitely going to be better. So that's quite often the biggest one, is more just, I'm not saying don't take it, but
fine tune here a little bit.
Yeah. Here's why you're not feeling great, or you've had some stomach problems, or you're not sleeping well, or just kind of pare it back a little bit. And that's the most common one, I think.
I think a point on that, Sam, is also cycling is a bit special because we actually don't have our athletes coming to training at the same place every day. So you can actually go a whole season without seeing some of your athletes. You obviously have a contact on mail, phone, or something like that.
Remote
but just
contact.
because we sort of spread out everywhere, and a lot of the riders will train with other people, and then it's sort of like, oh, I'm taking this, and then they see this guy, he's flying
doing
and
well,
training, and then all of a sudden they're taking it too. So it's one of those things in cycling, because people are not based in the same place and seeing each other on a daily basis. It can be very hard to control those things and actually influence people, or making sure people are not influenced by other people who have the wrong ideas.
Yeah, so true. And guys, if we circle back to the beginning here and talk a bit about mindset, and of course, you alluded to it, Sam, of having a staff, a very multicultural staff that can bring a lot of different viewpoints and backgrounds and experience to the whole performance story. Can you talk a bit about that, or maybe give us an example of throughout a camp or throughout your time with the team, of how that's really impacted how you guys operate and how you support your athletes?
That's a very good question. I think a really good example is probably actually the race foods that we have, the non-product based race foods, so things like rice cakes, little like sweet bruschettas with like Nutella and that kind of stuff. And so we have quite a few of our staff are from the Basque region in northern Spain there. So
nice,
we quite often
have
yeah, exactly, yeah. So we quite often have like Basque cakes, quite a famous little tart from that region. And that's something that they were like, oh, you want something that's small, tasty, easy to, well, here's something that we have in our area, and that's come in, and they've become quite a stable component of the sort of race foods that are available on the bus, that aren't like I don't want to say like a proper food, but like a whole food type piece. So it's cool when you actually go to when you go to a camp and Nicki's cooking. Like I reckon I've done it enough times now that if you gave me like 3 plates of food that were cooked by Nicki, or 3 plates of food that were cooked by Sean or Jakob, one of the guys who comes and does some contract work with us, I reckon I'd be able to tell which one was which.
Nice.
Not because they're like it's just like real nuanced little stuff. Like the like Jakob is also from Denmark, and so like when he makes a salad, it's like you can tell there's like a Scandinavian twist to it. Like you put strawberries in with fennel and some like some kind of cool bits like that, and you're like, oh, actually this flavor profile works really well. Whereas Sean is American and based in Spain, so when he makes a salad, it's very different. It's kind of more Spanish in its orientation, and there's just like little things like that I think really bring such value in the diversity of foods and approach. They hit the same fundamental goals, but it's having that variance that the guys become exposed to, and when they go to another race, they're like, oh, hey, Sean made this. Can we ask for this? So, and
cool.
it's cool. Like we have a WhatsApp group with the chefs and myself.
Recipes and pictures of food.
Yeah,
gets everybody hungry.
A lot of good stuff. A lot of good wine goes in there as well,
which is good to see. So, antioxidants, right?
Exactly, phytoalloxic polyphenols. But yeah, I mean, Nicki, you might have some maybe you're a better one to ask her that question.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. It's always hard working with food because everyone thinks they're an expert on food, and everyone sort of have a relationship or an understanding of food. So everyone have their thoughts on what is right and wrong.
Yeah.
And especially when we're coming from that many different countries, the Italians, bike riders, they eat pasta and then that's it. If you're a bike rider, you eat pasta. That's what the Italian mentality. Whereas, the Spanish people are more towards rice and stuff like that. So it's one of those things. It's very good that we have that many different cultures because they all bring something to the table. But sometimes, everyone thinks they're an expert on food, and it can be a bit frustrating when you're like trying to cook for them.
Everyone's food is the best.
Yeah, I still haven't cooked a pasta for an Italian where they would say, no, like this is really good. They'll always be like, this is really good, but it's not Italian. Like it just needs what needs to be different. They're like, I think it's the water in Italy. It just makes the pasta taste better, and you're just like,
well, that's a tough one.
To be fair, if you eat badly in Italy, that's your fault.
Yes, true.
That's what we always say on the team. So one of the sports directors, he only eats pasta for 1 month a year, and that's when he's at the Giro.
There you go. Well, it's cool to see that those creative tensions are great for creativity and the art of the practice, but they can, like it anywhere, they can push over the line a little bit and get into those nice competitive juices flowing. Listen, guys, I appreciate you carving out some time. I know you're both very busy. To wrap things up here, where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your fantastic work?
Instagram, Twitter. I think you basically just need to put in my name, Nicki Strobel, and then I'll show up somehow. That's where we normally. Twitter, we keep more like a bit more text and stuff, where Instagram is mostly just food pictures.
Nice.
I'm on Twitter. Twitter and LinkedIn, probably the best places to find stuff and bits and pieces of information. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. We'll put those links up in the show notes, guys. Appreciate the time, and take a good rest this summer if you can.